Forest Grove Toastmasters Executive Board, chaired by Bob, asked me to give a talk on effective use of parliamentary procedure in running meetings. I appreciated their vote of confidence, but I decided to arrange for a real expert to give a talk on parliamentary procedure. When I was Educational Vice President of the Hillsborough Toastmasters Club, I soon realized that I could not, at least I felt I could not, effectively chair a business meeting or an executive board meeting. So I arranged for Jon Woodworth to make an hour-and-a-half presentation to the Hillsborough Club about parliamentary procedure. Jon came with outstanding credentials. He was the past District 7 Toastmasters governor. He was the parliamentarian at events as high as the regional Toastmasters and the Heart Association conferences. And he's also vice president and regional sales manager for First Interstate Bank, serving the Metro West region, which includes the Hillsborough and Forest Grove areas. Not only did Jon, when he presented, demonstrate his very able Toastmaster skills, but with the 17 years of experience talking and teaching about parliamentary procedure, he even made it make sense to me. Go ahead. Because of Jon's ability to teach how to present, discuss, and vote on main motions, and his ability to teach what the results of a main motion really mean, I felt comfortable using parliamentary procedure during the business and executive board meetings in Hillsborough. I have been grateful ever since. I'm looking forward to continuing to learn more about parliamentary procedure from Jon Woodworth. Mr. Woodworth.
Thank you very much, Dale. I'm going to kind of move this out of the side because I kind of like to move around when I talk about this subject. I'd like to begin by giving you a disclosure. That's bank terminology. I mean, I'm going to tell you something that I'm not. I am not a registered parliamentarian. What I am, though, is a common, ordinary citizen like yourself that is interested in parliamentary procedure because, like you, I belong to groups like Toastmasters and other groups in which parliamentary procedure comes into play. And up until the time that I first started getting interested in parliamentary procedure, I would look at the bylaws, just like you may on occasion glance at a bylaw and it says that Robert's Rules of Order will apply. Then we'd get to a meeting and people would be making motions and they'd be amending the motions and so forth, and I wasn't sure if what was going on was right or wrong. So I decided to get the book and find out for myself. And what I found out in the book is that Robert's Rules of Order can be as strict or as loose as you'd like it to be. And where it applies depends on the size of the group and the camaraderie that you have within that group. In a group of this size, where we have about 15 people here, you can be a lot more loose than you can if you had a convention that had 1,500 delegates. Because you're friends here. And to miss a beat or to say something wrong isn't going to mess things up. Whereas if you did that in a delegation of 1,500 people, that may happen. So my purpose tonight is not to tell you all the ins and the outs and all the nuances of parliamentary procedure, but give you some concepts and some ideas that will help you in meetings that you will attend so that you can be a little more knowledgeable, a little more sure of yourself on what is going on during these meetings. What I'd like to start with is talking about the one motion which I know you're all familiar with, and that is the main motion. All right, that's the motion that you're most commonly used by you in this club or any other organizations that you belong with. And before I go on, outside of the Toastmaster group here, who belongs to other organizations in which parliamentary procedure comes into play? Outside of Toastmasters. Okay, we have 3 or 4. Some of you will get to that point if you're not there now. And so hopefully this information will come in as use to you at that time. The first part, of course, for the main motion, and there are 6 parts. First thing, someone has to make the motion. Now, if you read the book, it tells you that there is a specific way that you make a motion. That is, you say, I move, and then state your intent. You don't say, I would like to make a motion, or I will make a motion, or I'd like to put a motion on the floor, anything like that, is you simply say, I move. Now again, when you're in a small group like this, you're amongst friends, saying, I would like to make a motion that we do such and such, to me, there's nothing wrong with that. You're getting the point across. Everyone understands what you're trying to do. Again, in a very large, structured organization, then you should use the proper procedure, which is, I move, and that states your intent. If we were to talk about Toastmasters group, and I will be regarding that when I go through this presentation quite often, I will, a motion may be like, I move that we change the location and time of the Forest Grove Toastmasters Club to Tuesday night at 7 o'clock at Tektronix. That is a main motion, okay? So the first thing that has to happen is someone has to make the motion. Then someone has to second. Now, the only thing that bugs me here, and I'm sure it bugs you, are the wiseacres in the crowd that when someone says, I second the motion, they say, I third it, I fourth it, I fifth it. That's an old joke. It's what you call a cliche, and I don't really appreciate it too much myself. I mean, just saying I second the motion or second or something of that nature is all that's necessary, because all you need in order to get a motion onto the floor is that two people have to agree that it should be talked about. And that's what the seconder does. Now, one thing that I want you to make sure that you also understand about seconding a motion, that does not mean that you're in favor of the motion. Right? What it means is that you would like to have that subject debated. Therefore, you'll second the motion in order to allow that to happen. Okay? The third step is a repeat of the motion by the chairperson. Now, this is one step that can be completely eliminated, again, in small groups, in which, especially like we're in a U shape here, in which everyone is facing each other. So if someone like Dale were to make a motion, everyone would be able to hear it. But you get into larger groups in which they may be in what's called classroom situations, where they're in rows, and now someone makes a motion, that person may be right in front of the room. And when they make the motion, the only person that's going to hear it is the chairperson that's sitting there facing them. Everyone else in the back is going to be like this. What did they say? Okay? So at that point, then the chairperson has to relay the motion back. All right? Now, this also sometimes creates some rather interesting situations, because sometimes the chairman is not listening real closely to the person that's making the motion, and so when it comes time to repeat it back, they can't remember exactly what they said. For example, if I right now were to ask you, what was the motion I just made here about 3 minutes ago? How many remember what it was and could repeat it back right now? Okay, some of you think you can. Go ahead and try it, Bob.
The motion was to hold the future Forest Grove Toastmaster meetings on Thursdays at 7 p.m.
Oh, missed it, see? See? It's Tuesday, wasn't it, folks? Yeah. Okay. So that sometimes presents a problem. So as a chairperson, you've got to be very aware. Either you have to have a very good secretary sitting over there that's writing things down verbatim. So when it comes time to repeat the motion, you can lean down and ask them what it was. Or you can always turn back to the person that made the motion and said, why don't you stand up, turn around, and repeat your motion. That would be fine. Okay? Or one other thing you could do is you can paraphrase. There's nothing wrong with paraphrasing as long as you don't change the meaning of the motion. For example, I gave the motion as to change the Forest Grove Toastmasters Club to Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. There's nothing wrong with saying changing it to 7 p.m. on Tuesdays. I just switched those two. So that's paraphrasing. I didn't quote the motion, the person that made the motion verbatim, but there's no change in the intent. The intent was to change the meeting date to Tuesday 7 p.m. Whether it's Tuesday 7 p.m. or 7 p.m. on Tuesday, makes no difference. Okay? Once the motion has been repeated back to the group, if that step is used, then you have the debate. Now, this is the most interesting part of a main motion, and it's the one area in which, even in a small group, you have to be fairly consistent, as you would in a large group. And it's probably also the one area in which, generally, there are some problems and it's misused. When you have a motion on the floor, there obviously are going to be some people that are in favor of the motion and some people that are not in favor of the motion. Okay? And what you need to do during debate is try to set up a debate as much as possible so that you alternate between those that are in favor of the motion and those that are against the motion. All right? Now, the first person that has an opportunity to speak is someone that should be in favor of the motion, and that person should be the person that made the motion if they want to speak. They don't have to. Okay? So going back, if Dale had made that motion, after we repeated it back, and I turned to Dale and said, would you like to speak on your motion? He could just stand there like a bump on a log and say no, or he could say, yes, I would, and then he has his say. Okay? Once that is done, how do I know which one of you that may be raising your hand to speak next is going to be opposed to the motion? I can't tell. Okay? So what I do is I make it very simple. It says I will now entertain comments from someone who is opposed to this motion. Now the only hands that should be up are someone that's opposed. If not, and they start talking in favor of the motion, for example, I can call them out of order. All right? Now, if I ask that question and there is no one that's raising their hand that I'd like to speak against, then I can call on someone that's in favor of it. Another thing in the area of debate that also doesn't occur, and I'm sure you've seen this happen in meetings, is everyone gets to speak at least once before anyone can speak twice. So everyone gets their chance to say something before Dale gets to speak his second time. Okay? Even though he made the motion, he's got to sit there and be quiet until everyone else has had a chance. And a lot of times you'll find a club where a particular individual time and time again will get an opportunity to say something, to repeat their position when other people would like to speak. So that's why I say this is one area where you do have to stay fairly close to the vest, because especially if you have a real emotional or evenly split type of question where there is going to be a lot of debate on it. And I'm sure if we were to put a motion on the floor at this meeting to change the time and the date that this club met, there would be a lot of division and a lot of debate. So you have to make sure that you control that as best you can. Okay? Now, when debate is concluded, and there's two ways that you can tell if debate is concluded. First of all, no one says anything. And it's amazing how many chair people will stand up before a group and says, is there any other further discussion on this motion? And no one's raising their hand, no one's trying to get recognized by the chair, and the chairperson just sits there and stares at them. Right? When all they have to do when that says, I sense that you would like to vote. Now, instead, what they're waiting for is someone to call for the question. All right? We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But that's the two ways that you can vote. One is to call for the previous question, and the other is just to ask for a vote because it is obvious from the reaction of the crowd that no one else wishes to discuss this motion. Okay? Now, when you come to the vote, and that, of course, is step number 5, again, in a small group like this, it probably would not hurt to take a voice vote, right? But I would recommend that you get in a habit of not taking voice votes. Instead, you use the raise of a hand or stand up when you're counting the vote. And I'll show you why. Sometimes you have people that are very, very strongly in favor or opposed to a particular motion. And when a voice vote is called for, they'll do anything they can in order to get that passed. All right? And one of the things they'll do is that they'll be very vocal. You also have a lot of people that aren't very outgoing. Right? A lot of you in this room, before you started Toastmasters, were probably in that boat. I know I was. And now you're getting more confidence and you're more outgoing than maybe you were in the past. But when the vote is called for, you know, say all those in favor, you say aye. And that's all you hear. And if you add up about 10 of those, it's, you know, it's one big aye. Then you have the people over here, you know, Bob and I were really opposed to this. And so I said, all those opposed say nay. Nay! Now, if you were the chairperson, which sounded like it had probably more people voting for it, okay? These people over here that were yelling it, and over here they're saying aye. Well, that's why you shouldn't take a voice vote. You can't be any noisier than this when you raise your hand, right? And it's really easy to count the hands or to have people stand up. I'll tell you though, when you have them in rows, I ran into this situation once that becomes a real problem. And that is, some people are taller than others. And isn't that amazing? I just discovered that in Toastmasters for Parliamentary procedure. And we had people in rows. And there were about 100 delegates. And when they stood up, you know, it was real trouble trying to count because, you know, some of the people were standing behind taller people. So it's a lot easier when you raise your hand. It kind of levels everyone out. When we're seated, we're all about the same height. Then, you, of course, you always have those idiots, you know, that are like this, you know. But you've got to watch out for those. Okay. Of course, you can always go farther than that. You can always go to the secret ballot. And there's nothing wrong with that. But normally when you're voting on a main motion, just a raise of the hand would be more than sufficient. After the voting is done, then you have to announce the vote. And that is the last step. And the announcement of the vote is not, you know, there were 14 in favor and 7 against necessary. You can just say the motion passes. But it doesn't hurt to say there were 14 votes cast in favor and 7 cast against, the motion passes. Now, at this point, I'd like to talk about some interesting situations that come up when you're talking about main motions. And I'm sure some of these I know you've had. And we will take questions, by the way, when I'm doing this, so go right ahead.
Let's talk about the issue of question. If there's a very active debate and it seems to be just kind of drooling around, people still want to express their ideas a second, third, fourth time. And somebody says question. Do you say somebody has and somebody opposes that? The question is really, I move the question.
I move the previous question.
And it takes a second and a
Okay.
vote to do that,
Right.
doesn't it?
If I
there's a
could,
problem-
we're going to talk about that motion a lot when I get into other motions,
Oh,
other
okay,
main motions.
all
So
right.
I would like to hold
All
that
right.
question off. Okay, a couple of things I'd like to talk about when you take votes and some other things that happen with a main motion and a lot of other motions for that matter. One is, what happens when you abstain? By abstaining, what is meant is you don't vote. First of all, being advised that under no circumstances in any election in these United States are you ever required to vote. Whether that be if you're voting in a presidential election or if you're voting in a Toastmasters club, you are never required to vote. Now, that presents some real interesting cases that I've had to make decisions on as a parliamentarian at meetings, because a lot of clubs have what they call, I've forgotten the name already, when you have a minimum number. Quorum. God, I don't know what's gone in there. I missed it. Okay. They have to have a quorum, okay? Well, if let's say you have to have 1/3 of members present. Let's say you have 30-member clubs. That means you have to have 10 people there. Now, what they misconstrue is that means that on any vote that is taken, at least 10 people have to vote. That's not true. You could have an election in which the vote is 2-1. As long as there are 10 people present, you know, just because 7 of them abstained and did not vote, that's fine. Right? You do not have to vote. Okay, that's number one. The other thing is, what is a tie vote and what isn't a tie vote? All right. First of all, anytime you have a vote announced and it is a tie, the motion fails. It has to, in main motions, it has to be a majority. And if you have 20 people voting, 10 to 10 is not a majority, so it fails. But the presiding officer doesn't vote unless, in this situation, he can't, because he can break the tie. So he would vote, but he would vote in this instance only if he's going to vote in favor. He would not vote if he was going to vote against, because the motion's already failed. He doesn't have to show his preference. But he would vote if he was in favor of the motion and wanted it to pass. So the tie is 10 to 10. The presiding officer says, my privilege of voting in this situation, I vote for the motion, and therefore the motion passes 11 to 10. Okay? Now, he can also vote in one other instance. Let's suppose there are 19 people out in the audience. And the vote is 10 to 9. And the motion is passed. He can now, if he's against the motion, he can vote to cause the tie. If he's in favor of it, of course, again, he doesn't have to vote, because that would make it 11 to 9, and it's already passed. But he's against it. So now he votes, and that creates the 10 to 10 tie, and now the motion fails. So only 2 times that the presiding officer votes. One is if there's a tie vote, and they're in favor of the motion, and the other is if it's a 1-vote majority, and they're against the motion. Under no other circumstances should or can the presiding officer vote. Just that simple. Now, there are some groups in which they absolutely forbid the presiding officer to vote. And all you have to do is look at the bylaws of that organization, and it will specifically state whether that is the case or not. If nothing is stated, and they say they follow Robert's Rules of Order, then this is the situations in which the presiding officer would vote. Okay. When you come to elections, sometimes there's a question of can you elect someone on a plurality as opposed to a majority? Because anytime you talk about motions in Robert's Rules of Order, you're always talking about a majority or 2/3, and we'll be talking about that a little bit. The answer is it all depends, again, on what your bylaws say. If you look at the rules in which we operate for electing a president, for example, we elect them on a plurality. We haven't elected a president to a majority in a long time, okay? So they have less than 50% of the vote, and they're elected into office. But they have more than any other candidate. If you look at the city of Portland, for example, though, there you are required to be elected by a majority. So when they have the primary, they will get it down to, you either win it there outright, because you'll get the 50%, or they'll have the two highest candidates then will run off in the fall to find out who really is the to be elected. And that only happens when no one gets 50%. Okay? So it all depends on what the bylaws or what the rules of your particular organization say. Normally, though, plurality is not the general rule. It's usually the exception. Okay. Can the presiding officer, that's the person that's standing before you and conducting the meeting, introduce a motion? Yes and no. Okay? They can't, in the sense that they can't stand up there and says, I move that we change the meeting time of Forest Grove Toastmasters to Tuesday night at 7 p.m. But there's nothing that says that before the meeting they can't ask someone to make that motion on their behalf. Now that doesn't mean that Bob would say, on behalf of Jon Woodworth, I would like to move. No, they just say, I move, and they get it on the floor. Okay? So the presiding officer cannot make a motion at any time during the meeting, but there's nothing that says they can't have other people that they've arranged in advance to go ahead and make motions on their behalf. Or if, obviously, hopefully Bob would agree with me about the change before he made the motion. Okay, at this time I'd like to distribute a handout. Now, this is put out by Toastmasters International. It's called the Chart of Motions. And for those of you that don't want to purchase the book, and I'm sure there's not too many of you that do, I found this to be a very good source to talk about and to understand some of the more common motions that you'll run into. Some of these that are on this sheet, even though you will find are probably that you've never heard about or wonder how it's used in real practice. So even some of these are not what you would call common usage. I'd like to talk about just generalities about this first of all. You notice that there are 5 motions right at the top that are called privileged motions. Now, we're going to talk about these in more detail, but those are the highest ranking of all motions. In fact, the first 12 motions that are listed on this sheet are listed in the rank of importance. Importance meaning that if motion number 8, which is the limit or extend limits of debate, is on the floor, then you can put a motion number 6, move to lay on the table, would be in order. But a motion to 10, refer to a committee, would not. Because 8 has precedence over 10, but it doesn't have precedence over 6. Okay? Now, just in case that's not clear, let's go over that again. Because we're going to talk about some of these. If someone has a motion on the floor to limit debate, right, suppose you have a limited meeting time here that's to 6:30. If you were to have a business meeting in which you were to discuss changing your time, you would want to make sure that you discuss this thoroughly, but you also need to take a vote. So what you do is you look at the clock and someone would hopefully, this again could be the presiding officer that tells someone that you make this motion. You might move to limit debate to no later than 6:25. Right? That motion is seconded, is passed. It is now on the floor, okay? Now, someone else then moves to lay this motion on the table. That is in order, because it outranks the motion to limit debate. So if someone then, later on in the discussion, after you have some more debate on this, says they just get fed up with this, they say, I move we lay this on the table, and it's seconded and passed, that's fine. Okay? However, if someone instead were to say, I move that we refer this issue to a committee, that would not be appropriate. That is out of order, because it does not outrank the motion to limit debate. Okay? Is that clear now? Okay. Now, as you go across this particular sheet, you'll also see that there are some columns. One is called interrupts speaker, And we're going to talk about some of the motions in which you can actually interrupt the speaker. Those are always fun to deal with. And then you have those that require a second. Notice that there are some on here that do not require a second. There are very few, and we'll talk about why they don't. Whether they're amendable. And you'll notice most of them are, but there are some that are not. Whether they're debatable. Some of them, there's no debate, you go to an immediate vote. And then lastly, what is the required vote? We'll go over some of those that are 2/3 on why they are. Okay? First of all, though, let's take the second motion. Now, we're going to skip the first one, fix the time to which to adjourn, because I would doubt that you'll ever run into an instance in which you'll need to use that, because that is a motion that's only used when you're in a non-permanent society that has a limited time frame. And all you're doing is saying, let's adjourn, but let's meet again 2 weeks down the line, or 2 months, or whatever it is. When you have something like a Toastmasters club, or a lot of other organizations, they have regularly scheduled meetings. So you know that even if you don't conduct all your business today, you know you have next week, or next month, or next quarter, or whenever it is, to do it again. All right? So that means that for all intents and purposes, for what you'll be using, the highest ranking of all motion is the motion to adjourn. Now, how many of you knew that before you came here tonight? I'll tell you, back in 1973, when I started this, that absolutely floored me, that that's the highest ranking motion. There is no other motion that takes precedence over a motion to adjourn. So you look at all these other motions here, and any others that can come to your mind, if you know of any others, and they don't take precedence over a motion to adjourn. All right? Now, you notice, though, that you can't interrupt the speaker. In other words, you have to be recognized from the floor. It does require a second. Someone else has to agree with you to put that on the floor right now. It's not amendable. You either adjourn or you don't, so there's no reason to amend it. It's not debatable. There's no debate. You know, people may groan or something like that when you put it on the floor, and there may be a lot of business, but there's no debate, and all it takes is a simple majority. As long as half of you plus one would like to leave here right now, all someone has to do is make the motion, have a second, and vote on it, and you're gone. Okay? That's all there is to it. All right. Okay, the next one down, normally you don't use unless you're in all-day type meetings. That's to take a recess. You know, sometimes we just need to take a break. You know, we've been debating motions for the last hour and a half. Let's take a break. Or you're in a real heated debate on a particular issue that you've been going at it for 20 minutes, and you say, let's take 5 minutes and rest, or something like that. But notice it is the next highest ranking motion. It also means, though, that if there's a motion on the floor to take a recess, then a motion to adjourn would take precedence over it would be in order. Okay? Raise a question of privilege. Okay? This is different than move the previous question. What this has to do with is if there's something that is either of a bother to an individual or of a bother to the group that's preventing you from conducting business. Now, what that could be is that when we first came here, I was a little bit early, this room was, the divider was up and there was a meeting going on here. And with these types of dividers, as I'm sure you're aware, it's a little tough to meet in one room and when you're hearing people talk in the next room, it's really disturbing. That is the type of situation that could go on where someone could rise and say, I move a question of privilege. Okay? What they're saying right then is that there is such a disturbance going on that I can't concentrate, I can't hear, I can't think, something of this nature. Okay? Or it could be, I'm sorry that since I don't know a lot of people, it could be that you're sitting there talking to this gentleman rather loudly and she says, that's ridiculous. Okay? So she moves for question of individual privilege. And what she's saying is, presiding officer, will you shut these two guys up because they're making so much noise I can't hear what's going on in the meeting. All right? That's if the presiding officer doesn't go over there and says, will you guys please keep it down? You can talk when you're called on, okay? All right? Now, look at some of the things that you can do on this. Can you interrupt the speaker? Yes, you can. So here's poor Bob over here, you know, he's just talking to him, he's really going strong, giving his points on why we should change, and all of a sudden Dale stands up and says, I raised to a question of privilege. And he just drowns old Bob out, okay? And as soon as he does that, the presiding officer has to say, Bob, will you be quiet now? We have a question of privilege over here, okay? Notice then that it does not require a second, because when that happens, it's because only one person has to be disturbed and interrupted. So no one has to second it. What the presiding officer does then, he turns to the person and says, what's your question? What's bothering you? What's going on that's preventing you from participating in this meeting? Okay? It's not amendable, it's not debatable. Okay, and there's no vote taken. Once Dale has said what he wants to say, then the presiding officer just makes a decision. You know, you're right, you shut up, okay? Or he says, no, that's all right. You know, the people over there talking aren't disturbing us that much. I think we can continue our meeting. And then he goes back. And what he does then, if Bob was over here talking, he goes back to Bob, says, Bob, now would you continue with what you were saying? Because he's handled that question. Okay? The last privilege motion is call for the orders of the day. Now this one is probably misused more than any motion that I'm aware of, because you can't have an orders of the day unless you have an agenda. And most meetings of small groups like this don't have agendas. Now I don't know how often you have business meetings, but when you do have a business meeting, usually the presiding officer has a couple notes scribbled on a sheet of paper, but you people out there have nothing. There's no agenda. Okay? And as such, there are no orders of the day, so you can't call for the orders of the day. All right? Now, if you have a formal agenda, though, that says, well, we're going to talk about old business here, and under old business it says we're going to talk about changing our club location, and then next it says new business, and under new business we're going to talk about refreshments at our meetings, and the presiding officer comes and says, well, I'm going to entertain a motion to discuss refreshments at our meetings, and someone says, call for the orders of the day. And the reason they're doing that is because you forgot to discuss the meeting change, which was number 1 on the agenda. So as long as you're following the agenda, you can't call for orders of the day. And if you have no agenda, there are no orders. Okay? So that tells you one of two things. Either if you have an agenda, follow it closely. If you don't have, or maybe it's better that you don't have an agenda at all. Okay. On that motion, though, notice again you can interrupt the speaker. And of course, it's because when someone is starting to talk in error, you need to stand up or make it known that something's wrong. Doesn't require a second again, it's not amendable, it's not debatable, and no vote is taken again. Okay? Now, I'm going to skip a couple. Well, I'm not going to skip the next one. Lay on the table is another one that is misused. Lay on the table, believe it or not, is not the type of motion to put a motion to bed and say goodbye, good riddance. It's not a way to not vote on a motion. All that does is saying we want to postpone this until something else is discussed. Okay? Let's go back to you're discussing refreshments at your meeting. And you have this motion that to change the meeting place, which and your president Bob's getting here and he's looking at his watch and it's 1/4 and you haven't even brought that to the floor. Okay? So he might come over here and nudge someone on this side of the room while someone else is over there talking and says, okay, what I just said was move to lay it on the table. And what that does is says, let's go on for a while, and then let's come back to this. Okay? And what that does is allows then for the presiding officer to go on and start discussing or have a motion brought forward to change the meeting place, discuss that, vote on it, and then have someone to move to remove it from the table. Okay? And then you bring that question back up right where you left off. All right? You don't have to redo the whole thing again. You just continue to debate where you were. Sometimes you actually specify when it will come from the table, and then you don't even have to have a motion to remove it from the table. The motion may say, I move we lay this motion on the table until after we discuss and vote on the motion to change our meeting place. Now you know exactly when it comes back in. And if you have an agenda, it just slides right in there automatically. Okay, let's move to previous question. We had a question on this one already. This is probably a very misused motion. It's a very simple motion. To move the previous question, all you're essentially doing is you're saying that I want to take a vote on this particular main motion, or the motion that is pending that is in debate right now. And hopefully other people agree with you. Now, when is it appropriate? Well, it's appropriate any time the first 8 motions aren't on the table. Okay? Excuse me, the first 6 motions. So any other motions on the table, it's appropriate to move the previous question. Now, first of all, though, you can't interrupt the speaker, so you're going to have to be recognized first in order to do this. But once you are recognized and you make that particular motion and someone seconds on it, then it's not debatable and you vote on it. All right? Now, what you're doing with this motion is you're asking to cease debate. That's all you're doing with it. You're saying, I would like to cease debate. And you do it under circumstances, as was mentioned by this gentleman. You know, the same arguments are being hashed over 3 and 4 times, you know. There's no new information that's coming out in this debate. It's pretty well decided that the arguments in favor are these things, and the arguments opposed are these things. And it's also, by the looks of the people around, it's probably pretty well, people have made up their mind, and no one is saying anything that's changing anyone's mind. So if someone says, I recognize this, and I think we ought to end debate. Now, you also notice that this particular motion requires a 2/3 majority. This motion and the others down there that you see that require 2/3, look at the nature of those motions. The one is the previous question, which is the closed debate. Limit or extend the debate. You go down to number 17, suspend the rules. Number 18, object to consideration. And number 22, which is to rescind. All of those, the reason they require a 2/3 vote is because we're taking away your rights. And in Robert's Rules of Order and parliamentary law, anytime we take away your rights, it requires a 2/3 vote. Right? And when you cut debate, we're taking away your rights, and that is your right to debate a question. Right? And so it takes 2/3 of us to agree that we should end this right now. Not a majority, but 2/3. Right? And again, to go back to something else I mentioned, it takes 2/3 of those that are voting. Now, again, you do not have to vote on this. So if you have 20 people in the audience that can vote, and only 6 of them need to vote, 6 of them vote, 4-2, you've got it. And the previous question is moved. If that particular motion passes, in other words, it gets a 2/3 vote, then you immediately go to a vote on the question. Debate ceases. That's exactly what it means. And I have up here what happens after debate. You vote. Okay? So if you voted to cease debate, now you need to vote on the question. Now, a lot of people get the impression that if you're voting to cease debate, that's a sign that you're voting for the motion. Please never think that. There have been 100 times, if not 1,000 times, I've voted to cease debate and been against a particular motion. But like I said, that what you're looking for is that situation where all the arguments have been made, there's nothing new that's being presented, people have talked 2 times or 3 times, and it's time to get on with the meeting. Okay? So once you've taken that vote, then you go immediately to the vote on the question that is pending. Okay? Now, if this situation occurs on an amendment to a motion, you don't go to the main motion, all right? Before I talk about that, let's talk about an amendment to a motion. If you look at that, that's number 11 on your list, okay? It's what they call a subsidiary motion. I didn't mention that a privileged motion is a motion that has no relationship to the question on the floor, but is of such importance or urgency that it needs to be solved right away. A subsidiary motion, though, is just the opposite, in the sense that it usually has something to do with the question that's on the floor. Okay? But it is also of importance, and that's why they're ranked as well. The motion to amend, you can interrupt the speaker. It does require a second. You can amend an amendment. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. It is debatable, and it requires just a majority to pass. Let's go into that for a while, and I'll move over to this blackboard for a while.
I'd like to talk about the vote issue. Again, unless it's specified in the bylaws of the organization, according to Robert's Rules of Order, it's only either a majority or 2/3 of the voting people, not all the people in the room.
Of the votes cast, right?
Okay, so if your bylaws say, like a city councilor has to be 4 votes, even if there are only, like it's a 9-member board, and it has to be 4 votes, yes. And but there's only 4 people, or let's say 3 people voting, there still has to be 4 votes.
Okay. If you have special rules, right?
Yeah, okay.
Right. All I'm saying is that Robert's Rules says you never have to vote, and that's still the case in that situation. Just you don't have enough to vote. All right. In fact, some ways that people, which I don't know why they do it, that are on council like that, sometimes do abstain, which defeats a particular motion, when they could have defeated just as easily by voting no. And I don't know why they don't. Politics. We won't get into that right now. Okay. Motion to amend. Let's go back and let's talk about that motion that we talked about a little bit earlier, in which we're going to change the meeting place and time, not place and time, date and time of this club. So the 2 elements of that motion are date and time. Nothing else about that is changing. We're not changing the name of the club. We're not changing the location, because I said Tektronix and I kept it Forest Grove Toastmasters. If you wanted to have a main motion that says I move that we change the name of this club to the Banks Toastmaster Club, and that we move the location to U.S. Bank and Banks, and we change the time to 7 p.m. on Tuesdays, you could have to do all one big main motion. That's fine. But we're not going to talk about that, okay? Instead, we're going to talk about only two elements, date and time, all right? Now, suppose that as you start into your debate on this particular main motion, someone says, you know, I don't mind meeting on Tuesdays, but it seems that people are really having a problem in this group with 7 o'clock. So he says, I move to amend the motion on the floor and change it to 6 o'clock instead of 7. Now, when you amend, that's one of the things you can do, all right? You can alter what's stated. You can also delete it, all right? Now, you could do that by saying, I move that we delete the time, which is fine in this situation, because then all you're doing is changing the date, and you would continue to meet at 5 o'clock. But all you'd be doing is changing from a Thursday meeting to a Tuesday meeting, okay? You can also add to. You could also amend this by, as I mentioned before, it says, I would like to move that we amend this by adding the words also that we change the name of the club to the Banks Toastmaster Club. Okay? So those are 3 ways that you can amend. Once this motion that we're talking about that I put on here, though, the change the time from 7 to 6 is the amendment, the only other amendment that would be possible would be one that has to do with the 6 o'clock time. A motion to change the date or a motion to add to this main motion would be out of order. So you can't have 2 amendments on the floor at the same time unless one amendment amends a motion that's already there. So you can have someone that says, I move to amend the amendment by changing the time to 5:45 p.m. So as long as you stick with the time, you can have an amendment to the amendment. Okay? So that's why they mention it here, that it's not, it says, can it be amended, and it does say yes. Okay, but that's the situation in which you can. You cannot have 2 amendments, though, on different sections of the motion on the floor at the same time. If someone else would like to amend later about the date, change it to, say, Wednesday, they have to wait until this particular amendment is voted on before they can enter that amendment onto the floor. Yes?
What if they did it this way, say, I amend the amendment from 6 to 4:45 and would like to change the name to Bank?
No. The only thing they can talk about now, because see, the issue on the floor is not the motion of the name, the date, and the time. The only motion on the floor right now is the time. So that's the only thing you can amend. Okay? Now, it also mentions here that amendments are debatable. So in that essence, it's no different than the main motion. But the change that occurs at this time is that the debate must be on the amendment only. If anyone stands up and starts talking about the date, they're out of order. Because the motion that's on the floor now is the amendment, not the main motion. So that's one thing that the presiding officer has to be careful of, is that people don't start talking about the date when what we're trying to do is determine whether 6 o'clock would be a better time than 7. All right? When you come to the vote, it goes the same way as it does for a main motion, and if it's a majority, then the main motion then becomes the amended main motion. Okay? And so what the presiding officer should do then is repeat it back the way it has been amended. Okay? I move that the motion is that we change the time and date of the Forest Grove Toastmasters Club to Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Is there any further discussion on this motion? All right? Now, on the question of call for the previous question, if it's called on an amendment, it only applies to the amendment and not to the main motion. So let's again say that someone moves the previous question, and this amendment to change the time to 6 o'clock is what you're discussing. The question passes by the 2/3. That means you take an immediate vote on the amendment. If that passes, then you go to the discussion of the main motion as amended. So when you move the previous question, it concerns the immediate question on the floor, not any of those that may be attached to it as well. Okay. Moving down, you see the next one, number 12, is postpone indefinitely. This is the one that you do want to use when you want to discard a motion forever. Okay? And suppose you're sitting here debating something, and it's pretty obvious that it's not something that anyone is really all that interested in, or it's a piddly type thing, or something like that, and someone says, I move we postpone indefinitely. Okay? What that does is just, if it passes, then the motion, of course, is no longer going to be debated, and it never comes back unless someone sometime later brings it back as a brand new motion. Okay? Now, this particular motion has another purpose that I see it. There's always a lot of debate on whether the presiding officer should have the ability to speak out for or against a particular motion. And Robert's Rules of Order is very specific. They can, but what they have to do, though, is relinquish their position as presiding officer to someone else, speak on the motion, either for or against, and then they cannot take back the position of the presiding officer until that particular question is settled. In other words, a vote is taken. All right? Can you see what's coming here? So I'm standing up here, and we're debating this change of date and time, and I'm getting really antsy because you people are missing the point on why we want to change this time to 7 o'clock and why we need to change it to Tuesday nights, you know, and I want to speak on this motion. So I say, after someone has completed their say, I say, Dale, would you please take over the gavel? I'd like to speak on this motion. And Dale agrees. Okay? That's another thing that has to happen. He has to agree. I can't force him to do that, because maybe he wants to continue debating too. But he agrees. So he comes up here. You don't need to stay there. And I go off over here and I debate the thing. Now I can't take that back until we have a vote. So Dale now presides over the meeting. He goes into discussion of the pros, the cons of this motion, and finally old Bob over here says, I really didn't like John anyway. Okay? So he says, I move we postpone indefinitely. There's a second. It passes. I can never be presiding officer again, because we've never voted on the motion that I relinquished the gavel for. It's a nice way to get rid of your presiding officer. Okay? Now, in practice, you wouldn't want to do that to your poor presiding officer, would you? But I'll tell you, it's a good way to teach them a lesson in the fact that as presiding officer, they have certain limitations. They have a lot of power up here as presiding officer. Because, I mean, they could just, with a stroke of their gavel, call you out of order, and unless someone is really astute and challenges the decision of the chair, they just can go right on. And if they know parliamentary procedure and the rest of the audience doesn't, they can just really buffalo. You know, that's out of order, you know, and they don't know from not, whether it is or not, you know. So you have a lot of power up here as presiding officer. So as such, they also limit you and say that you can't participate. All you do is control and make sure that those that are participating are doing so in an orderly, efficient fashion. All right? So that's one way to get back to your presiding officer. You notice now the next one, number 13, is the original main motion. I mean, we've gone through all these motions, and we finally get down to number 13. All those other motions are more important than a main motion, yet that is, in most people's minds, of course, the most important of all, because when you make a decision on a main motion, something's changed. Right? And on some of these others, maybe nothing's changed. It just is for efficiency or for some other reason that you're making this motion. But when you pass that main motion, something has changed. Okay? But it's only the 13th of all ranked motions. Now, when you get below that, you start talking about incidental motions. Now, incidental motions have no ranking. And sometimes they will fit in, depending on what you're debating, ahead of some subsidiary and some privileged motions. But generally they do not. They're usually attached to main motions, and they are incidental to what's going on. And let's look at some of those. Point of order. This is one that you should use frequently, either the point of order or the questions or points of information, number 16. All right? You should use these frequently. All right? You use point of order if you know parliamentary procedure and question someone's decision. Okay? You use the information if you don't understand parliamentary procedure but would like to know more and want to make sure that what's going on is correct. Okay? So let me give you some examples where you use that. Okay, like I said, as a presiding officer, you have a lot of power. So let's suppose that debate's going on and it's something that I, as a presiding officer, feel very strongly one way or the other, but I can't speak on it. So I start goofing off, not goofing off, I start doing it wrong in the sense that I keep calling on people that are in favor, because I'm really in favor of this motion. I mean, I don't like Thursday nights, I want to meet on Tuesdays, folks. So I keep calling on people that are in favor of the motion. If you know anything about parliamentary procedure, you say point of order. Okay? Now, if you look at point of order, you notice that I can interrupt speakers, and that's one reason, because otherwise, as presiding officer, I just ignore you, and you'd never get your opportunity to speak. So you can interrupt the speaker. Now, when that happens, the presiding officer must say, state your point. Okay? And the point that you state is that you're not allowing a fair debate. You're only calling on people that are speaking in favor of the motion. You need to equalize it and call on people that are against the motion as well. Okay? He's raising a question about parliamentary procedure, and that's what the point of order is used for. Okay? Point of information is when you don't understand something. Okay? And that may be dealing with the proceedings that are going on, or it could be that you don't understand what the person has just said. Right? Suppose that someone in the audience is one of these that insists in their mind that, in order to sound and look more important, I got to use, these 25-cent words. And so they start using these 25-cent words, and you're sitting there looking at the guy next to you wondering, I wonder if he's understanding this, because I don't have the slightest idea what he's talking about. So afterwards, you say point of information. And again, the presiding officer says, state your point. He says, I like this interpreted what this person just said. I didn't understand a lot of the words he used. That's a point of information. And then someone has got to describe it. And sometimes that falls on the presiding officer, and sometimes they didn't understand what was just said either. Or it could be that someone will state a fact that you didn't know existed, or that you doubt. Okay? That would be a point. You say, point of information, what is your source? Where did you get this information? Okay? So we're not talking about parliamentary procedure per se, but we're talking about, I need more information than what you've given to make sure that I can, massage that in my brain and come up with the right decision. It can also have something to do with parliamentary procedure, though, again, if you're a complete novice. Okay? And the question may be, why does she get to speak before he gets to speak? Okay? Now, if you have those type of people in the audience, those are the type that your presiding officers hate, though. Because about every 2 seconds, point of information, I want to know what's going on. That's when you reach over and you get the book out and you hand it to them and say, read this. Okay. Going on down. Appeal, that's one in which you use when the chair has said something that you disagree with, the decision they've made, so you appeal the decision of the chair. And you will find that you use this quite often. In a case that I mentioned earlier where you have the aye voters, very quiet, and the nay voters are very loud, and he says, well, obviously the nays have it. You can sit there, well, wait a second, I know at least 10 people over here that voted aye, and there's only 4 people over there. You say, I appeal the decision of the chair. Okay, suspend the rules, number 17. This one doesn't come up too often, but when it does come up, it's usually done improperly. A lot of people think that you can suspend Robert's Rules of Order, and you never can suspend Robert's Rules of Order. If your organization is following Robert's Rules of Order, they must always be followed. What you can suspend, though, are bylaws. All right? So you may have particular bylaws in your organization that say that in order to be elected, there must be at least 50% of the voters must be women. Stupid rule, but it's in there, okay? So you look out in the audience and you say, well, geez, there's only 40% women. So you say, then someone says, I move we suspend the rules, and the reason you're doing that is because you want to hold the elections. There's nothing in Robert's Rules of Order that says anything about what sex the audience must be. That's a bylaw rule of your organization. So you suspend the rules for a moment. Now, one thing you have to be careful with there, though, is a lot of organizations also have very specific instruction in their bylaws on how bylaws are amended. And you can't supersede those either. So if the bylaws say you must have at least 30 days written notice, then you can't suspend the bylaws. Not at the meeting, because now you're superseding those rules, because the rules specifically state you must have 30 days written notice. So about the only thing you could suspend right there is the orders of the day, the agenda. So this one is not used very often. Okay, moving on down, object to consideration. Now, that would come up in a Toastmasters club, for example, when the topic of discussion or the motion is something that has nothing to do with Toastmasters or the business meeting of a Toastmasters club. All right? For example, someone may move to say that I move that the Forest Grove Toastmasters Club endorse abortion. Okay? What is a Toastmasters Club doing, coming out publicly for or against abortion? It doesn't matter which way you go. That's not something that Toastmasters, that's not your purpose. You're an educational club. So you have no reason of even bringing that up. But if that motion is seconded, then someone else may say, wait a second over here, you know. I disagree with this, and they move for that it be the object to consideration of the motion, okay? And that would be in order and would be take precedence over the main motion. That's where that one comes in. Division of a question. All right, what happens here is we're talking about date and time, okay? And someone sitting out there in the audience says, you know, I really agree with the date. I mean, I'd love to start meeting on Tuesdays, but I don't like the idea of meeting at 7 o'clock. And we could amend it, you know, we could do that. But instead they say, well, let's divide the question. So what they say is, I move that we divide this question and talk about the date as one motion and time as another motion. That's all you're doing, okay? Now this is, in some of the motions that you get in some organizations, you know, the motions are very, very long. They're very, very involved. And that's what you do on those, is you just kind of split it up, okay? Sometimes an organization will adopt new bylaws, in which you'll have a committee that'll go through and they'll just completely revamp the entire bylaws. And what you'll do there is you'll do the one that's number 20, which is consideration by paragraph. And what you do is you take one article at a time, is what it says. Now, if there's no real objection, you can vote on the whole thing if you want. But normally someone says, well, I object to what's in Article 1, line 4, and someone else says, I object to what's in number 9, line 6. And it's pretty obvious that you're not going to be able to vote or debate the whole thing. So you take it by paragraph or by article and debate them each individually and vote on them individually. You can do the same thing with this question. If we had also had the name as part of the motion and also the place, then you could split it 4 ways. We talked about each of them individually. Okay? Okay, division of the assembly, that's when you have a vote and it's impossible to tell you know, what the outcome is. And this happens generally, of course, with a voice vote. When, especially when it involves a 2/3 majority. Never use a voice vote when it involves a 2/3 majority, because now you think it's difficult when it's a majority. It's very difficult when it's a 2/3, because you can't really tell, is that 67% of the people or is that 64%? It makes a difference. So, but anyway, so when you have a vote in which it's pretty difficult to tell what the outcome is, then you just have a division of the assembly and you find out for a fact what it is, and you do that by either raising the hand or a secret ballot or whatever the case may be. The last two that are mentioned here, one is to rescind. This is what you do when a motion has been passed and maybe some time has passed and you say, on second thought, let's don't do that after all. You go through and you vote for this change at the date and the time, and either later on in that particular meeting or maybe next meeting, you hear it is Tuesday and only half the people show up because everyone said, oh, I prefer Tuesday, yet your attendance drops off by half. Someone says, let's rescind that. Okay, that's one way to do it. Another way is just say, I move that we change the date and time to Thursdays at 5 o'clock at Tektronix. You can do it that way too. But it'd be just as easy to rescind that motion. And when you rescind that motion, then it reverts back to what was in place previous to that motion. Okay? And the last one is to reconsider. And that would be, suppose you, again, you pass this motion and you say, you know, this is great, except, you know, 7 o'clock isn't quite as good as I thought it was, and either it's Tuesday, let's reconsider, let's debate it some more. Okay? And that's where you'd use that. Notice that on the motion to rescind, though, it takes 2/3 because the majority has already spoken and said, this is what I want. So in order to take away some of our rights on something we've already passed, it now takes a 2/3 vote. Okay? And with that, that really concludes my remarks. We're done a whole half hour early. I will entertain any questions that you may have. Yes?
Do you know if the legislature of the state of Oregon operate under Robert's rules?
I know for a fact that they do not, and neither does the U.S. Congress. They have their own rules. In fact, the word filibuster does not exist in Robert's Rules of Order, yet it sure does in U.S. Congress, okay?
Let me ask you a question. In an organization that says that they operate under Robert's Rules of Order and they do not, and they do some things that are not according to Robert's Rules of Order, is that illegal?
Okay, now we're getting back to my original premise when I was telling you about what's the purpose of Robert's Rules of Order. If you're in a small group amongst friends, and I would say something like the Forest Grove Toastmasters Club would probably be such a group, you can break all sorts of rules and probably come to a consensus of what this club really wants to do. All right? But there will be times in which you may have a division of your group. Okay? And if you ever debate this subject, and believe me, it has been debated in Toastmasters clubs, that may be that point where you have that division. And when that happens, that's when you've got to walk on eggs and be very strict and follow the rules. If you don't, then you're not serving any purpose, okay, by having them say it or by trying to railroad something through. What you're going to do is hurt the club, okay? So in that case, you should be very strict and follow the rules as closely as possible. If someone isn't, then hopefully that group that is against what's going on, this railroading that's going on, should be very insistent that this whole procedure stop and that we do this properly, okay? Beyond that, there's not much you can do. But you have to consider what is going on. You know, I've been to meetings that have been very, very sloppy. You know, it says, I'd like to make a motion that we change our time to 7 o'clock and our date to Tuesdays. The reason I'd like to do that is because I feel that Tuesdays are a much better night. The Blazers usually don't play on Tuesday night. I mean, here they are debating it, and no one seconded the motion. How many times you run into that? Okay, but you're amongst friends, a small group, so you let them go on, and they sit there and give their reasons why, and then someone finally says, I'll second that. Or how about the situation where you sit there and debate a motion that isn't even on the floor? How many times you've gotten into a discussion about something, saying, you know, we should really change our place and time to Tuesdays at 7 o'clock. This room I know is available, and the Blazers don't play. And there's no motion on the floor. So you're sitting there and you debate this subject before a motion is even made. And finally, after about 10 minutes of debate, the presiding officer finally says, would someone like to make that into a motion, please? Okay? And you say, yes, I move, I second. And you already had all your debates, so then you go right into the vote. There's nothing wrong with that, because you're amongst friends. But I'll tell you, if you have one of those delegations where there's 1,500 people, you know, like when Rotary International was here in town, 12,000 delegates. Now you tell me that you can sit there and have a debate before there's a motion on the floor with that large of a group. You can't. You have to be very strict, very precise. In fact, they are so precise in Rotary International is that you have to submit in advance. They tell you that they do have a printed agenda. And they will tell you exactly what's going to be discussed at the business meeting. I mean, it is so precise. I mean, there's no other business allowed on the floor. You have to submit to get on the agenda something like 60 days in advance. Okay? So you're really making your motion 60 days in advance. They'll actually formalize it by having you make the motion to the group. But you say, okay, this is the issue that we'd like to put on the floor. Then when it comes time for that issue, you also they always limit debate. There's a certain time frame that motion is made and passed, and then they have the debate, and usually those people are pre-selected. Okay, so I mean it's very structured and you just can't sit there and raise your hand in the audience and say I'd like to speak on this. You'll never be called on. The presiding officer for some reason will just never see you. But when you're talking about 12,000 people, that happens. You've got to let someone know that, yes, I'd like to speak on this particular motion when it comes before the floor, and then they will write you on a little list, and if they get down to you within a limited debate, you'll have your chance to speak, okay? You always have your chance to vote, so even if you're not called on, you can always vote against the motion or for it, whichever it was that you were going to speak on it. But you don't always get the chance to debate, especially when they limit the debate. Okay, anything else? Okay. I would like to mention one other thing, and for some reason I didn't have my sheet of paper here, something else that comes into play at regular meetings like this, and then I'll let you go home early. Or I guess that's not my choice. Point of order, right? Okay, and that's something that's referred to in the book as general consent. Something that you see a lot, again, in groups of this size, and sometimes even larger, it doesn't matter how big it is in this, is that it happens most frequently when the presiding officer says, the minutes of the previous meeting have been distributed and are in front of you. Are there any corrections, additions, or deletions? And there's dead silence. And no one says anything. So then the presiding officer says, I will then entertain a motion to, he doesn't have to do that. Don't do it. That's where general consent comes in. If no one is speaking up that there's no corrections, deletions, or additions, then they have no objections, do they? So you just say, sensing none, the minutes stand approved as written. And you move on. No votes taken, no motion. Now, if someone out there objects, then they can, raise a question. Fine, then you can vote on it, okay? But since something like that would only take a majority anyway, and no one has had any corrections or additions or deletions, there's no debate on it, so why vote on it? You just move on. It's called general consent. You can even do it after there's been a correction or two. Maybe someone says, well, in paragraph 3, you misspelled my name. My name's Jon Woodworth without an H, it's Jon. Would you please correct that for the minutes? The presiding officer says it will be corrected. He says, are there any other corrections, additions, or deletions? No one says anything. He says, hearing none, the minutes stand as corrected. And you move on. Where this also comes into play is in elections. Now, I know Forest Grove Toastmasters Club is such a dynamic club that you always have 3 and 4 people that are just, busting there to get elected to the office, right? Oh, you don't? You're like most clubs and you're lucky if you get a full slate? Okay. So here you have one person that's been nominated for president, one that's been nominated for administrative vice president, one that's been nominated for educational vice president, and so forth. Why vote on them? You don't have to. If that's all you have, the nominating committee comes back and says, here's our slate of officers, and then the presiding officer says, are there any other nominations from the floor? And you hear none. He just says, then this slate is elected. You move on. Why vote? Okay? Because all it takes is one person to vote anyway, remember? So if you know someone out in the audience will probably vote for that person, then you just move on. That's called general consent. And it can really speed up meetings. Okay? Now you wouldn't use it, again, going back to our situation here, where you have a spirited debate on changing your date and time. I mean, here's a main motion on the floor. I mean, it's just going fast and furious back and forth. And finally the presiding officer says, well, since the debate is over, the motion passes. Okay? That would be using general consent, but I don't think it would quite fit in that situation, okay? All right. Anything else? Yes, Dale?
What's your suggestion for how minutes are written, or what should minutes say?
Okay. There's debates here too. I think again a lot of that depends on what's the past experience and the precedence that's been set. Now, if any of you have ever gone down to a local library and looked at the congressional record, they put everything in there. I mean, it's verbatim. You can see every and everything else that anyone said that's in the congressional record, and it comes out monthly, and it's about that thick. Okay, so that's everything that's been said in the Senate and the House, and committee meetings for that. Again, what I feel though is that what you should put down is what's necessary, because minutes should be what was approved. The debate is not important. Okay, when you have the motion, it was moved and seconded and passed, for example, that the Forest Grove Toastmasters Club changed their date, their meeting to Tuesday at 7 o'clock p.m. at Tektronix. What else is important? That's what your minutes should reflect. It was moved, second, passed. The fact that you had 20 minutes of debate is superfluous information. It's not necessary. Spirited debate or not, the motion passed. So what's important is the fact that you're changing your date, you're changing your time. Or you could put, move, second, and failed to change. All that's saying is you had a spirited debate and the nays won. But it's important information. It shows that the motion was presented, it was seconded, it was debated, but it failed. So those are the two extremes, and I like the one because if you're ever a secretary in a club, brevity is a lot better than. It makes it also easy because all you have to do is write down the motion, and then sit back and listen to the debate, and then put down P or F. You're done. Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much. And do I return it to you, Dale, or Bob? Bob?